In small-town Maine, police pursue the killer of a young mother for 20 years, waiting for technology to match their perseverance. A student disappears on his way to class.
Bye.
A ransom is demanded. Is it a kidnapping, con game, or something far more sinister? Detectives in Washington State must find a way to outsmart a killer who knows their every move before he slips through their fingers. Murders of passion can often lead investigators straight to a killer. But when the clues are few and the leads tenuous, detectives know they are searching for something emotionless. A killer who is cold-blooded. Maine, November 23, 1976. Police discover a car in the bushes near River Road. The engine still running. There was no one in sight. The officer called in the license plate number. The dispatcher said the car had been reported missing by the owner, Vaughn Stevens. Stevens claimed that his girlfriend had borrowed the car earlier in the evening to do some shopping, but had not returned. Inside the vehicle, the officer discovered blood on the passenger seat. Vaughn Stevens was contacted and asked to respond to the scene. The officer continued to examine the vehicle. Inside the trunk, partially covered by a jacket, he discovered the body of a woman. She was wearing only a pair of socks. Homicide investigations in rural areas fall to the state police. After being notified, investigators began to scour the area for clues. When Vaughn Stevens arrived with a friend, he positively identified his car. His friend had to identify the victim in the trunk. She was Stevens' girlfriend, 30-year-old Janet Baxter. Distraught, Stevens was allowed to leave the scene. Maine State Police Detective Chick Love continued his investigation.
In the car, we found the groceries that she had purchased at the store that night. We found the sales slip, the cash register tape that told us what store she was in and exactly what time that she was there.
The coroner's autopsy revealed Janet Baxter had been shot in the head and chest with bullets from a .22 caliber handgun. She had also been raped. Biological evidence from her body was preserved for testing on glass slides known as slide mailers. The bullets and slide mailers were sent to the crime lab for further analysis. The car Janet had been driving also underwent a thorough investigation. Forensics experts dusted the exterior and discovered a set of latent fingerprints. In the trunk, a single hair was retrieved. Later examination showed it did not belong to Baxter. Hoping to find witnesses, detectives began canvassing the area near River Road. One resident, Clarice Merrill, said she had seen something odd the night before. While driving home, Merrill saw two vehicles pull off the road at the same location where Janet Baxter's body was later found. One of the cars was a yellow Volkswagen. Merrill believed the other car was a Ford LTD. Inside, she saw a man and a woman. The woman appeared to be asleep. Merrill helped create a composite drawing of the man in the LTD, while police began making efforts to locate the yellow bug. In most murder cases, spouses and significant others are always considered suspects. The victim's boyfriend, Vaughn Stevens, was questioned in depth the next day. He agreed to take a polygraph test. He told police that Janet Baxter worked as a nurse and had recently been through a bitter divorce.
No, sweetie, you need to get back to bed.
She had custody of her daughter, Julie.
Let me help you with that. You got that?
Around 9:30, Janet decided to go to the store. Stevens' car was blocking the driveway. He gave her his keys.
All right.
All right.
Janet said she would be back in a few minutes.
Around midnight, she didn't show up.
When she failed to return, he phoned police. The polygraph test indicated Stevens was telling the truth. Detectives also questioned Baxter's ex-husband,
We're investigating a homicide that happened on November 23rd.
but he had a solid alibi, and like Stevens, he was dismissed as a suspect.
I was working that evening.
Investigators continued searching the area for a yellow Volkswagen.
Can I help you?
Good evening. I'm Detective Chick Love. I'd like to ask you a few
A
questions.
local resident, Galen Lessard, owned a similar car.
I'm not involved in this.
When questioned, he was uncooperative and refused to be interviewed.
No, you got the wrong person. You need to see someone else. Okay, bye.
Investigators probed Lessard's background. Though nothing in his records indicated he was capable of murder, investigators learned he was friends with other men in town. Their records told a different story. One was a suspect in the murder of a college co-ed 5 years earlier. Another slightly resembled the composite drawing Merrill had helped police assemble. But none of these men would talk to authorities. The investigation threatened to turn cold. On November 28th, almost a week since the murder, an officer noticed a white sedan parked at exactly the same spot where Janet Baxter's body was found. A man was standing outside the car. He appeared to be looking for something. The officer noted the registration and passed it along. Investigators ran a check on the plates and learned the car belonged to a man named Albert Cochran. A background check revealed that Cochran had done prison time in Illinois after pleading guilty to murdering his wife in 1964.
Any different
Despite a sentence of 50 to 75 years, he was paroled after 12 years. In early 1976, his parole was transferred to the same town in Maine where Janet Baxter lived. Cochran was brought in for questioning.
You observed that crime scene last night?
He claimed that on the night of the murder, he was smoking marijuana and drinking with 3 strangers in the parking lot of a local bar.
There that day?
And on my way back,
They invited him to a party, but he didn't want to leave his car near the bar, so he moved it to a supermarket parking lot,
he gave me a ride.
the same
back to
one
the
Janet
grocery store.
Baxter had visited the night she was murdered.
Police over there. I was just curious. So I went over there.
Cochran said he got in the stranger's car, but made them pull over and let him out when he became suspicious of them. He claimed he then walked several miles to his brother's home in Norridgewock. On the way, he stated he saw police gathered at an area off of River Road. Though he refused to take a polygraph, investigators obtained fingerprints and samples of his hair for comparison with previously gathered evidence. Cochran's fingerprints were examined and compared to those lifted from the exterior of the car in which Baxter was found. His hair sample was compared against the hair found in the car's trunk. Neither the prints nor the hair samples produced a match. There was no hard evidence pointing to Cochran as the murderer. The investigation hit an impasse. For the next 20 years, the case was passed down through dozens of detectives, each one running into the brick wall presented by the lack of hard evidence. It seemed Janet Baxter's death would never be solved. But her family refused to let it go. "20 years had passed since the murder of 30-year-old Janet Baxter in the small New England town of Norridgewock, Maine. During those years, no arrests had been made. Robert McCleary, Janet Baxter's father, was determined to keep the case alive, no matter how long it took to solve. Every year on the anniversary of his daughter's death, he would call police headquarters.
My desire to continue my contact with the state police was deeply motivated by my desire to see that somebody paid for what they had done to Jan, that somebody was not going to get away with murder, and that to continue to seek the information, to continue the investigation, and to give us some sense of closure.
In 1996, the case was handed over to Maine State Police Detective Mike Mitchell. After reviewing the case files, Mitchell paid a visit to Janet Baxter's parents.
Detective Mike Mitchell,
How do you do?
State Police. He's here to
The
say
detective
some
had
things to
grown
us.
up near Norridgewock and had been in elementary school when the murder occurred.
Well, Mr. McClary, Mrs. McClary, I'm a detective with the Maine State Police, and I just want
He promised he would do everything in his power to solve this case.
If you have any questions of me, don't hesitate to call.
Mitchell began by retracing the steps of the previous investigations. He was struck by the loose ends presented by the owner of the yellow Volkswagen, Galen Lassard, and his cronies, who refused to talk to police. Despite those unresolved issues, he decided to take another crack at Albert Cochran.
Some detectives felt that Albert Patrick Cochran was a suspect and was the person responsible for the murder of Janet Baxter. Some detectives felt that it was another group of people that socialized together. So what I did is I took down all the names of all possible suspects that hadn't been alibied, not to have been in the area at the time, and listed them all down on a piece of paper, and by priority as to who looked like a better suspect than the others. And Albert Patrick Cochran was on the top of the list.
To make his case, Mitchell first had to inventory what evidence had survived over the years. He contacted Maine State Police forensic chemist Chris Montagna.
My other two roles were to see what was still around as far as evidence that had survived 20 years, and second, to reconstruct the notes and the work that had been done 20 years earlier and try and piece all of that together and link it to a suspect that Detective Mitchell was working on as the murderer of Janet Baxter.
Now let's see what we've got. We've got the Volvo,
Searching through the boxes of evidence, investigators found the original slide mailers. One looked blank, but was thought to possibly contain swabs of biological evidence from the victim's body. If the evidence had remained intact, it might be possible to extract DNA, a technique not in existence 20 years before. Under the microscope, the slide surprised everyone, revealing the presence of biological evidence removed from Janet Baxter.
So both of them have last names. This one.
Oh, wow, I see him.
Now the number of.
Now, investigators needed to find a DNA sample from Cochran. They did not have to go far to find what they needed. The The sample of Cochran's hair collected in 1976 was also preserved in the file. But would the hair have viable material for DNA testing? Forensic DNA specialist David Munich was given the assignment.
These head hair samples were known head hair samples. When they're collected, they're actually plucked from the head, and they have skin attached to the hair root, as opposed to hairs that are cut or hairs that just naturally fall out of your head.
Both samples provided ample material to perform the DNA tests. When the tests were concluded and the comparisons made, the results were overwhelming. The DNA tests showed there was only one chance in 37 billion that Janet Baxter's killer was somebody other than Albert Cochran. Munich called Detective Mitchell with the news.
When it came back a perfect match, I can remember I was driving down the road, I picked up my car phone, and I just couldn't believe it. My eyes filled up with water thinking that it was, you know, something you'll never forget.
Any idea of the date of birth?
It's going to be in March. I'm going to think March 17th, 1938, maybe. He's about 62 years old. Is this something?
But where was Albert Cochran?
What's his last name?
Cochran. C-O-C-H-R-A-N.
Computer checks tracked him down to an address in Stuart, Florida. On the morning of March 17, 1998, Detective Mitchell and Florida police arrested Cochran at his home. He was extradited to Maine to stand trial for the murder of Janet Baxter. Based on the evidence gathered over 21 years earlier, detectives believe Cochran had seen Janet Baxter alone in a deserted grocery store parking lot. His prior history of violence reasserting itself, Cochran seized the opportunity to abduct his victim, later raping and killing her. On May 20th, 1999, it took a jury only 2.5 hours to find Albert Cochran guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison, this time without the possibility of parole. Murder is not the only cold-blooded crime. In South Dakota, a mother's only son is held for ransom. Aberdeen, South Dakota, May 8, 1985. 20-year-old Michael Kinney left the home he shared with his mother, Sandra McNeil, to attend classes at Northern State College.
Yeah, I've been working hard on it.
All right, I'll be back.
Okay.
Bye.
When Michael didn't return by the following morning, his mother became concerned. She decided to look for her son. Near the house, she found Michael's car parked on the side of the road. Michael was nowhere in sight. Sandra McNeil contacted the sheriff's office. Brown County Sheriff Mark Milbrandt was assigned to look into the disappearance.
We had some concerns due to the fact that Michael Kinney's car was found across the roadway from his residence and had been parked there for, we're assuming, anywhere from 24 to probably 35 hours, 36.
The following day, Sandra McNeil received a mysterious phone call from an unidentified man. The caller told her to go to a bar in Aberdeen later that evening and look for an envelope under the payphone if she wanted to find out what happened to her son. She was told not to contact the police. Kinney's mother went to the bar and found an envelope hidden beneath the payphone. Inside was a ransom note demanding $200,000 in exchange for her son. Despite the kidnapper's warning, Sandra McNeil gave the note to sheriff's investigators, who examined it for clues. South Dakota Department of Criminal Investigations agent Doug Lake was brought in to assist with the investigation. His first priority was to deal with the difficulties of obtaining the money.
The ransom money was the victim's mother's money, and it was on Friday after the bank is closed, and the agents, the investigators, went around to the different banks in town and gathered up all the cash that they had on hand.
Go ahead. 3 days after her son disappeared, Kinney's mother received a second phone call.
Hello?
This time, investigators were listening.
Is my son okay?
Sandra McNeil was instructed to leave the money in Aberdeen Park at 9 p.m. Investigators traced the call to a public phone box, but the kidnapper hung up and disappeared before the police could close in. The phone had been wiped clean of prints.
Okay, Melgar Park. Just a minute, I have to write it down. Mike, all right? He's fine. Can I talk to us? Until I get to mine.
Investigators studied the tape. The caller stated Michael was not hurt, but refused to allow him to talk to his mother until the ransom was paid. The kidnapper described Michael's clothing to authenticate his threat. Investigators felt they had no choice but to follow the kidnapper's demands. The money for the ransom was bundled and placed into a briefcase. Investigators also placed a hidden tracking device inside. An undercover female police officer made the ransom drop as scheduled. A short while later, the briefcase was retrieved by a man who then ran off with more than he bargained for. Police quickly followed. The suspect drove to a residence where he parked the blue Oldsmobile he was driving, transferred the briefcase containing the ransom money to an orange Camaro, and was joined by an unidentified female from inside the residence. Led by the tracking device, agents followed the suspects across the Minnesota border. Just inside Minnesota, a roadblock halted the suspects' flight. They were ordered out of their car and arrested. The driver was identified as 19-year-old Todd Miller. The passenger was his 17-year-old sister. Agents retrieved the briefcase from the Camaro's trunk.
We got something here.
The car was closely examined for clues, but there was no sign of Michael Kinney or any other leads to his whereabouts.
The money. I'm telling you the truth.
Investigators questioned the suspect separately. After a thorough interrogation, investigators found that Miller's sister genuinely appeared to have no clue about Kinney's disappearance or the ransom money. She was released. Todd Miller told police a drug dealer named Bob Jacobs had asked him to pick up a package and deliver it to him in Minnesota.
Tell her.
Yeah, outside.
Miller claimed that in return, Jacobs had promised to help him financially. When asked if he knew Kinney, Miller said he was a good friend, but he had no idea Jacobs' job was in any way related to Kinney's disappearance. Miller's story provided investigators with an opportunity. They would use him in a sting operation to nab the drug dealer. The ransom money was returned to him, and he was transported to the prearranged delivery point. Jacobs never appeared. Detectives brought Miller back to the police station. The following day, Miller admitted that Jacobs' story was a lie. The kidnapping had been a hoax. Claiming it was all Michael Kinney's idea, Miller explained he had helped stage the entire plot. Miller said he had been friends with Kinney since high school. Alleging Kinney dabbled in various drugs and wanted to move to Canada, Miller stated he was recruited into the kidnapping scam as a way to help Kinney finance his planned relocation. Detectives put Miller through an extensive polygraph test.
Did you harm Michael
The results
Kinney?
of the test were inconclusive, but tended to show the overall truthfulness of his statements. That meant Michael Kinney was alive and on the run. A warrant was issued for his arrest.
Do you live at 123
Police in South Dakota continued their search for 20-year-old Michael Kinney. What had initially appeared to be a kidnapping was now starting to look like a deception.
have anything to do with the disappearance?
Kinney's friend, Todd Miller, claimed to be a reluctant participant in helping Michael Kinney stage his own disappearance and extort his mother.
As well as a swell web.
As the result of Miller's story, a warrant was issued for Kinney's arrest,
This is where
but his whereabouts remained a mystery. Detectives questioned Kinney's girlfriend. She told them she was with Michael the night before he was reported missing. He had dropped her off at her house after they had been out for a pizza and soda. She had not seen or heard from him since. Weeks later, an Aberdeen farmer made a startling discovery. After noticing a foul odor coming from an unused ice house on his property, he entered the building. There, he found a body. Police were immediately called to the scene. Though the body was badly decomposed, investigators found evidence of 3 bullet wounds and what appeared to be blunt trauma injuries to the victim's head. The farmer had no idea who the victim was or how the body ended up in the ice house. Through dental matches, police would soon learn the victim's identity. They had found Michael Kinney.
It was a big impact on us. You know, all of a sudden we went from a possible theft by deception warrant to a kidnapping murder, a homicide.
At the autopsy, the cause of death was determined to be a bullet wound to the aorta. Fibers, perhaps from a rug, were collected from the victim's clothing. It was estimated he had been dead for 2 to 3 weeks, possibly from the time of his disappearance. With Michael Kinney dead, the investigation shifted back to Todd Miller. For investigators, it was clear that he was the killer, but now they had to prove it. To determine if he had written the ransom note, he was returned to the police station to provide handwriting samples. While waiting for those results, warrants to search Miller's cars were obtained. Investigators discovered that the blue Oldsmobile Miller used to pick up the ransom money had been recently washed. However, detectives managed to find 2 hairs that had survived the cleaning. Fiber samples from the trunk were also collected. Next, the interior of the trunk was treated with luminol. This process revealed evidence of blood, but the samples were too deteriorated for analysis. The evidence was hand-delivered to State Crime Lab analyst Rex Reese for comparison. Reese compared fibers removed from Kinney's clothing to those removed from the trunk of Miller's vehicle.
There was an association of the fibers that comprise the liner in the trunk and present as loose fibers on the metal part or the base bottom of the trunk itself. These were black rayon synthetic textile fibers that comprise this liner. Present on Mr. Kinney's clothing were a number of these same type of black fibers.
Though the analysis was incriminating, it was only circumstantial. Investigators needed hard evidence that Michael Kinney had been in the trunk of Miller's car. Reese next compared the 2 hairs recovered from the Oldsmobile's trunk with those taken from Kinney's head during autopsy. But Reese could only make a general comparison. The hairs recovered from the trunk were too damaged for a conclusive analysis.
The hairs had been severed at the proximal end or near the scalp by blunt force, so we couldn't see any of the root structures there. But they exhibited human hair characteristics that were most similar to that of Mr. Kinney.
Reese's analysis brought investigators one step closer to making their case. But it still wasn't enough. Experts conducted an extensive examination of Miller's handwriting. The unique characteristics identified in the ransom note matched those from Miller's sample.
Mr. Miller?
Yes?
Despite his protests, Miller was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Detectives determined that Miller had wanted to help his father get out of financial problems. He turned to the person he called his friend. On the night of May 8, 1985, Michael Kinney dropped off his girlfriend and headed back home. Police theorized that he was flagged down by his friend.
How's it going, Mike? Hey, Todd.
Completely unaware of what was about to befall him,
Hey, Mike.
Kinney was an easy mark for the cold-blooded violence Miller had planned.
What's up with the gun, man?
After striking Kinney's head, Miller loaded him into the trunk of his car and quickly fled the scene. Miller drove to an isolated farm, where he then shot and killed the still unconscious Kinney. To cover his tracks, Miller hid the body in a derelict ice house. He then returned home and coldly set in motion his plans to extort Kinney's mother. At his trial, Todd Miller was found guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, possession of ransom money, and forgery. He received 2 life terms plus 20 years. In a community near Preston, Washington, another missing persons case was to turn deadly. On September 4th, 1996, Rex and Shirley Wren reported their son, 35-year-old James Brad Wren, missing. They told police that their son's roommate, Emmett Marcel, was known to be violent. The parents told police that 2 months before, Marcel became enraged at their son while the two were working on the house they shared together. Wren left the residence so Marcel could cool off. When Wren returned later that night, Marcel shot him in the leg.
Oh my God!
Their son had refused to press charges. The information was enough for police to open a missing persons investigation. A background check revealed that police had been dispatched to Marcel and Wren's residence several times before to settle angry disputes between the two men. On August 10th, a month after the shooting, Wren called 911 to file a formal complaint against Marcel for another incident. He had not been seen since. Assigned to the Major Crimes Unit of the King County Sheriff's Office, Detective Denny Gula headed the investigation to locate the missing man.
The last time he was seen was with a King County police officer. There was a disturbance at his house, and Sergeant Bachmeyer, the patrol supervisor at that time, had contacted him at home and transported him to the Fall City substation.
Gula began by reviewing the responding officer's log of the August 10th incident. Records showed that Sergeant Matt Bachmeyer had taken Wren to a nearby police station, taken a statement, then released him. Hoping for more detailed information, Detective Gula put in phone calls to Sergeant Bachmeyer. While waiting for a response, he continued his investigation. He questioned Wren's neighbors. One, Richard Pettygrove, recalled that the last time he saw Wren was on August 10th. He reported seeing Wren driven away in a police car following a fight between Wren and his roommate, Emmett Marcel.
A real angry
Richard
person.
described Emmett Marcel as a dangerous and angry person.
Yeah.
All of the neighbors felt certain Marcel had something to do with Wren's disappearance.
My business cards.
Detective Gula ran Marcel's name through the law enforcement database. Marcel had recently been put in a Tacoma jail for an unrelated traffic violation.
Check on license plate.
For investigators, it was time to pay a visit to the prime suspect in James Wren's disappearance.
CCU. Okay, thank you.
Police
very
in
much.
King County, Washington searched for 35-year-old James Brad Wren, reported missing by his parents. Wren's roommate, Emmett Marcel, was quickly becoming the prime suspect. Police went to question him in a Tacoma jail, where he sat for unrelated traffic violations.
Is your name Emmett Marcel?
Yes.
Marcel agreed to take a polygraph. He appeared unconcerned and claimed to have no idea about where Wren might be.
Did you or did you not?
On the evening of August 10th, the day Wren was last seen, Emmett claimed he was with a friend in nearby Tukwila, Washington.
You do not know why you.
Though the polygraph strongly indicated he was telling the truth, investigators were unconvinced. They obtained warrants to search Marcel's car. On the floorboard, investigators found a prescription bottle with Wren's name on it. They also found a hammer with a reddish-brown substance on it. In the lab, samples of the reddish-brown flecks on the hammer were tested, but no conclusive results could be reached. The samples were too deteriorated. The case against Marcel seemed to be going nowhere. A search warrant was obtained for Marcel and Wren's residence.
Anything else out of the unusual?
Inside, a suspicious stain on the carpet drew the investigators' attention. Samples of the stain were preserved on swabs. Detectives hoped this was the break they needed.
We're thinking that this is a pretty substantial piece of evidence. We sent it off to the crime lab for processing. And what we find out is that it's bovine or cow's blood.
With no physical evidence tying Marcel to Wren's disappearance, he was eliminated as a suspect. They hoped that Officer Bachmeyer, who had taken Wren's statement on August 10th, could shed some light on the disappearance. After several weeks, Bachmeyer finally contacted detectives and came in for questioning. He apologized for the delay, saying he was under a lot of pressure, which was recently compounded when his home had been burglarized and set on fire. In fact, he explained that when he responded to the 911 on August 10th, he recognized Wren. Bachmeyer was certain Wren was the person he had seen fleeing from his house after it had caught fire. When Wren was brought in to file his complaint, Bachmeyer confronted him about the arson. Wren admitted to the crimes. But after writing out his confession, Wren stormed out of the station. For Detective Gula, Bachmeyer's story seemed odd.
You know, people just don't storm off and walk out of the police station, especially when this person has just admitted to you to have burned your house down.
Okay, now let's try to...
Though it was unclear if Bachmeyer was involved in Wren's disappearance, investigators decided to take a closer look into the arson and burglary at his home. Detective Gula met with the Renton PD arson investigators who had been the first to look into the fire at Bachmeyer's house. After first believing the motive behind the fire was possibly an act of revenge by a criminal, they were now convinced Bachmeyer had set the fire himself. The arsonist had used flares stuck in plastic containers to start the blaze, a method that would give the perpetrator plenty of time to leave the scene before the fire actually caught. The investigation further revealed numerous valuable items, including jewelry, limited edition prints, CDs, and leather jackets, had been removed from the house prior to the fire and stored in the garage to avoid being damaged. King County Sheriff's Detective Sue Peters also worked the investigation.
Basically, Renton police detectives were concerned and thought Bachmeyer possibly could be a suspect because one of the neighbor ladies had actually seen what she believed was Sergeant Bachmeyer leaving on his motorcycle in the middle of the night, and then several minutes later, his house is on fire.
Due to all of the conflicting circumstances, Bachmeyer's insurance company had refused to pay his claim unless he took a polygraph, something he refused to do. He was stripped of his badge and gun and was suspended from the department. He was now the prime suspect in Wren's disappearance. But police had no motive and no body to suggest a crime had taken place. Investigators would have to outsmart a man who knew how to hide evidence. Police in Washington State were beginning to suspect that fellow officer Sergeant Matt Bachmeyer was responsible for the disappearance of 35-year-old James Brad Wren. According to Bachmeyer, Wren had confessed to torching and burglarizing the officer's home just before he disappeared. A copy of Wren's confession to Sergeant Bachmeyer was obtained. Each page bore Wren's signature. The statement and the signatures, however, appeared to be written in a different hand. But it was not unusual for an investigator to write out a story and have a suspect sign it. To be sure, the confession was sent to a handwriting expert. Examiners determined that the signature at the bottom of each page was in Wren's handwriting, while the statement itself was in Bachmeyer's. But the analysis revealed something more interesting. Though the entire statement was written in the same color ink, one type of pen had been used to write the first two pages, which pertained to Wren's complaint about Emmett Marcel, but pages 3, 4, and 5 had been written with a different pen. Those pages contained Wren's confession to the arson and burglary. For investigators, a clearer picture was beginning to emerge.
It was my belief that Brad Wren was going to be used as the suspect of the arson, which he was according to Sergeant Bachmeyer. And, you know, the case is really all tied together, that Sergeant Bachmeyer was becoming the focus of the arson of his own home, and so he needed to find someone that he could say set his house on fire to clear him. So he picked Brad Wren, who led a very simple life.
Search warrants were obtained for the patrol car Sergeant Bachmeyer used on the evening of August 10th. Small reddish-brown stains were found on the back seat and armrest of the patrol car. The rear seat covering was removed. Investigators were shocked to discover a much bigger stain in the foam padding. It appeared a large amount of substance had seeped through the upholstery and into the cushion. Samples of each stain were taken to the crime lab. They all tested positive for human blood. When confronted about the evidence, Bachmeyer stated Wren had experienced a nosebleed while in the patrol car.
You being the one.
Police didn't buy it. Examiners developed experiments to determine how much blood it would take to leave such a large stain under the patrol car's rear seat. By using different amounts of human blood to soak back seats from similar patrol cars, criminalists ascertained the absorption rate of the foam padding and the amount of blood needed to make a similar size stain. They determined that a minimum of 200 milliliters, or nearly a cup of blood, was involved. Far more than even the worst nosebleed would produce. Examiners had to prove that the blood in the patrol car came from Wren. But without a body, there were no samples to compare. It fell to forensic chemist Kim Duddy to find a way around that problem.
Both his biological parents were still alive and were willing to give blood samples. So our DNA unit took the blood samples from both his biological mother and father and tested it to the question stain on the seat from Bachmeyer's vehicle.
The DNA analysis showed that the blood from Bachmeyer's patrol car had come from the biological child of Rex and Shirley Wren. Even without a body, the evidence was now overwhelming that Sergeant Matt Bachmeyer was responsible for the murder of James Wren. The veteran police officer was arrested. If any doubt remained, it was cleared up on February 2nd, 1997, less than 3 months after Bachmeyer's arrest. Bone and clothing fragments were found near a secluded cul-de-sac in Cougar Mountain Park. Among the most identifiable pieces were a skull and a red, white, and blue cast. Keys to the gated park were found on Bachmeyer's keychain. Police believe that Sergeant Bachmeyer's scheme to make some easy cash by setting up a phony arson of his home backfired when his insurance company became suspicious. He needed to prove to them that criminal forces were out to get him. Wren became a patsy in his twisted plan. Sergeant Matt Bachmeyer was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Killers who strike without remorse, whose motives are obscure, can frustrate detectives in their efforts to solve a case. But dogged investigation, coupled with patience and the ever-advancing scientific methods of the crime lab, can often produce results, no matter how cold-blooded the crime. Police find a frozen body in the Arizona desert. The chilling discovery sends investigators searching for more victims. A small town, a brutal murder, and a killer who could be anywhere. When all leads are exhausted The investigation focuses on a blurry surveillance photo. When a young mother disappears, detectives are left with few clues. But slowly, the evidence begins to point to a dangerous and twisted predator. A lack of clues may cool down a hot investigation, but there's no statute of limitations on murder. Months or even years may pass before forensics can spark a fire under these cold cases. On June 3, 1991, investigators from the Costa Mesa, California Police Department pulled up to an abandoned car on the Corona del Mar freeway. They were responding to a call regarding a missing person, Denise Huber, age 23. No one had seen or heard from her for almost 24 hours, and that wasn't like her. Denise's best friend had found her car on the side of the road while searching for her. Investigators examined it closely, but aside from a flat tire, nothing seemed amiss. The only personal article they found was a pair of pantyhose on the front seat. Denise preferred to drive without them. Though nothing in the car tipped investigators about what had happened, Detective Ron Smith concluded that Denise ran into trouble soon after she had pulled off the road.
What struck us as unusual about the scene and concerned us right from the very beginning was that very near to her car there were emergency call boxes, there were pay phones, there were all-night convenience stores, none of which Denise went to call her parents or to ask for help. We knew right away that something was amiss, something was wrong.
The last person who saw Denise was her date from the night before. She had dropped him off after a concert. Denise never made it home. Bright, popular, just graduated from college, she wasn't the type to worry her parents by going off without a call or note. Her family and friends started to look for her the next morning. After recovering her car, the Costa Mesa police launched a massive search for Denise Huber. They notified law enforcement agencies across the country. They followed up every clue, every lead. Denise's friends and family put up posters and appeared on news programs begging for information. As the months and years passed, the tips dried up. But police kept Denise's case open and as active as they could.
Every day we would do something with the Denise Huber case. We would review old leads, we'd go over old reports again. We'd look one more time at the photographs. We never gave up, even though we never really had anything good to work with.
After 3 years, no one could tell her grieving family and friends what had happened to her. Denise Huber had simply vanished. Meanwhile, more than 300 miles away in Arizona's Prescott Valley, authorities were grappling with a mystery of their own. On July 9th, 1994, a woman went to buy paint at the home of a man she met at a swap meet. While she waited for him, she noticed a padlocked rental truck and the paint and chemical cans cluttering his yard. She thought they looked out of place for such a respectable neighborhood and wondered if any laws were being broken. Suspicious, she called a friend who worked for the police. Her friend thought it sounded like a clandestine drug lab, which police find in the most unlikely spots. He sent investigators from the Yavapai County Sheriff's Department to check it out. The rental truck with the California tags looked like it hadn't been moved in months. The electrical cord snaking out of it and the paint cans all around reinforced the notion that this might be a mobile drug lab. A check of the tag showed the truck had been stolen. Armed with a warrant, police cautiously opened the cargo door. Inside was a freezer.
Ready, guys? We're opening up.
Not knowing what it might contain, they suited up in protective gear. Plastic bags obscured the contents, but at the bottom of the freezer lay a pool of frozen blood. Carefully moving the bags aside, the officers expected to find nothing more than a deer. Instead, Lieutenant Scott Masher uncovered a horrific mystery.
Initially, when we opened the black bags and could tell that we had a human, a frozen body with handcuffs behind the back, ice crystals. It was grim.
The homeowner still hadn't returned, so police ran the license plates on the white pickup, also parked in the driveway. The owner was identified as John Joseph Famolaro. Within an hour, Famolaro and his mother pulled up to the house. Sheriff's deputies took Famolaro into custody, charging him with stealing the rental truck. They were anxious to find out more about the body in the freezer. Mrs. Famolaro, who lived next door, told detectives that her son was a house painter, which explained the paint cans. She said the truck had been parked there about 2 months. She didn't know anything about the freezer or its contents, except that the electricity in John's house had been turned off for 1 day, and he had asked to run a power cord from her house to the truck. At the police station, Famolaro was polite but uncooperative. He refused to answer any questions and asked to see his lawyer. Without any assistance from their suspect, investigators would have to rely on physical evidence at the scene to identify the body in the freezer and to find out how it got there. They charged Famolaro with homicide. The next day, warrant in hand, investigators entered Famolaro's house, hoping to find information about the victim in the freezer. In its frozen condition, they couldn't even discern the victim's gender.
Look through these things on the chair.
Famolaro's house was crammed with his belongings. This was the home of a man who never threw anything away. If clues were here, they'd be difficult to find. After more than 2 weeks of searching, investigators found several promising clues. The first was a set of handcuff keys that matched the cuffs on the victim.
Bag it and tag it. Okay.
The next clue took investigators by surprise. 2 complete Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department uniforms. In the garage, the deputies found 2 boxes marked Christmas, but there was nothing merry about them. Inside, officers found blood-stained women's clothing and a bloody hammer and nail puller. They also found a pair of women's shoes, the backs badly scuffed as though the woman who wore them was dragged.
Get a couple of bags here. A shot of this hammer.
And that wasn't all.
We did locate numerous female identifications. That included Social Security cards, I believe some driver's license, and other identification, obviously raising the concern of maybe we had additional victims.
Yavapai County Police had to face the very real possibility that John Famolaro was a serial killer. Arizona investigators looking into a murder had every reason to believe that there may be more than one victim. To test that theory, investigators brought in cadaver dogs to locate more bodies on John Famolaro's property. The dogs, trained to detect the slightest whiff of decay, alerted their handlers several times. Officers dug up every spot and still found nothing. But they never completely gave up the suspicion that the killer had struck before.
I just got the paperwork from Costa Mesa.
Police followed up on every piece of ID found in the Christmas boxes. Much to their relief, they found that each woman was alive and accounted for, except one from Costa Mesa, California. Her name was Denise Huber. To confirm her ID, Yavapai County forensic technician Mike Kinney lifted a thumbprint from the thawing victim and compared it with the one printed on Denise Huber's California driver's license. The prints matched, identifying Huber as the victim. To authorities in Arizona, the name meant nothing. But to Costa Mesa detective Ron Smith, it was the news he had waited 3 anxious years to hear.
The call I received from Lieutenant Scott Masher from Yavapai County was that he thought maybe he had a body identified as Denise Huber and asked us if we were familiar with Denise Huber. Well, of course, I almost fell out of my chair when he mentioned the name.
Now that she had been found, investigators in Arizona had to determine how she had been killed. Working with the frozen and decomposed remains presented a unique set of challenges to Maricopa County Medical Examiner Ann Buchholz.
In our environment, to examine a frozen body is very unusual. We deal 99% of the time with people who have been exposed to heat elements, and that is more our area of expertise than someone who has been in a cold environment. It took the body approximately 2 days to thaw, where we could actually perform the internal examination.
On Friday, July 16, 1994, Yavapai detective Scott Masher and Costa Mesa detective Ron Smith, along with other officers, gathered in the medical examiner's lab to observe the autopsy. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the skull, resulting in multiple fractures. To identify the murder weapon, investigators needed to evaluate the entire skull to see where and how the blows had been struck. They called in forensic anthropologist Laura Fulginitti.
How many days are we looking at here?
Reconstructing a person's skull is very similar to doing a jigsaw puzzle. Essentially, you have about 50 pieces and you need to put them back into what you know to be the right composition.
It took Fulginitti 2 days to reconstruct the skull, never losing sight of the fact that this victim was once a person.
And I remember standing in this very room thinking to myself, how did you come to be in my sphere? This is not right. It's not natural for you to be here.
She determined that the victim had sustained more than 35 blows to the head. The wounds were consistent with the hammer and nail puller pulled from the box in Famolaro's garage. To be certain, the lab ran tests. Technicians were able to establish a DNA profile from the blood residue on the nail puller. It matched the DNA profile taken of the victim's own blood. The match confirmed that they had found the murder weapon. To build their case, investigators had to retrace the events that led from the victim's abandoned car on a California freeway to John Famillaro's freezer in Arizona.
Covered initially for as far as the search warrants at this point.
It was very important for both agencies, the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office and the Costa Mesa Police Department, to work together and piece the evidence from California and Arizona to one case, one solid case, in order to successfully prosecute this.
The Costa Mesa Police Department gathered information on Famillaro's activities during the time he lived in California. They learned that he had attended the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department Reserve Academy, but he couldn't make the grade and dropped out after just a few weeks. He kept his uniforms, which police found at his house. Further investigation led detectives to a warehouse in Laguna Hills, 12 miles from where Denise Huber's empty car was found. John Famillaro had stored some paint and supplies in the warehouse, then moved everything out when he left the area in August 1992, 13 months after Denise Huber vanished. Investigators thought it was likely that Famillaro had committed the murder here. They hoped to recover forensic evidence that would tie the killer to the crime and determine where the killer's trial would take place. Police searched the unit for evidence of the crime, using luminol to expose traces of blood. Applied to a surface and viewed under an alternate light source, luminol reveals blood stains invisible to the naked eye, even traces left years earlier.
We found that the warehouse was huge, but I wanted every square inch luminol for blood. Almost the very last bottle in the very last corner that we looked, we sprayed luminol into the corner against the wall. And all of a sudden, the luminol just lit up. This bright glow showed us we found what we were looking for.
Technicians compared this blood to a sample taken from the victim in Arizona. They matched. The forensic analysis gave Detective Smith of the Costa Mesa Police the proof he needed to make the case.
The forensic science in testing the blood was absolutely critical. Number one, it established that the crime occurred in California, and that established jurisdiction. It also positively identified that blood as Denise. It put Denise at that scene.
Famillaro never confessed. The forensic evidence spoke for him. The investigators had successfully matched the blood in the California storage unit to the victim in Arizona, and that placed the victim within deadly proximity of John Famillaro. Authorities believe that Huber pulled off the road with a flat tire. Spotting his prey, John Famillaro approached under the guise of lending a helping hand. He abducted Denise Huber in Costa Mesa, California, in the early morning of June 3, 1991. Famillaro murdered her sometime later, hid her body in a freezer, trucked it to Arizona, and kept it until police discovered his crime 3 years later. John Famillaro was sentenced to death. He awaits execution on California's death row. Famillaro hid his crime by keeping the body close to him. Other killers are not so conniving, but they can be equally elusive. It was a December evening in 1990. Peggy Phillips wondered why her husband Dean was taking so long to lock up the laundrette they owned in Ozona, Texas. It was just next door, but he'd been gone 20 minutes.
Dean?
She found him lying on the floor, bleeding and barely conscious. Police and paramedics raced to save him. Peggy thought that Dean must have fallen and hit his head. But the paramedics could see that this was no accident. Dean Phillips had been beaten nearly to death. Peggy watched as the paramedics loaded her husband into the ambulance. It was the last time she saw him alive. Dean Phillips died early the next morning, December 26th. The cause of death? Blunt force trauma to the head. Investigators determined that Phillips had interrupted a burglary and paid dearly for it. They found only one hard clue, a single fingerprint lifted from a coin box left on the floor. They sent the print to the Texas Department of Public Safety. Like small-town police departments all over Texas, the Ozona police depended on the DPS crime lab for forensic services. This time, though, the Department of Public Safety came up empty. The coin box fingerprint didn't match anything they had on file. News of Dean Phillips's death spread through Ozona. Crockett County Chief Deputy Sheriff Alton Davis was determined to catch the criminal who had shattered the quiet of this little town.
We've got a population of probably 3,000 to 4,000 people, so it's a small town. Everybody knows everybody, and it was a real shock to the community that something like this could happen in Ozona.
The community stepped forward to help the investigation. A witness reported seeing two local men wearing bloody clothes the night Phillips was killed. A warrant was obtained, and their bloody clothes were confiscated before they had time to launder them. Brought in for questioning, the men claimed they were hunters and that the blood was from a deer they had poached.
Last night we had a very serious
Investigators were skeptical until they got confirmation from the DPS crime lab.
Let's get to the question. What time did you
The
get
blood was indeed from a deer.
10:30.
And the men's fingerprints didn't match the one lifted from the coin box at Phillips's laundry. The case's first promising tip amounted to nothing. A clerk at a convenience store right off the interstate gave investigators their next lead.
You got a couple of minutes I can talk to you?
Yes.
A man came in an hour before the murder and asked where the launderette was.
And we're just checking the neighborhood.
She described him as stocky, with dirty blonde hair and a t-shirt with radio call letters.
Oh, yeah? Oh, what time was that?
He drove a beat-up blue van with a green door on the passenger side. There may have been a passenger in the van. Investigators hope to see the suspect on the store's surveillance tape.
Okay, good. Okay. Okay. So you have a good evening. Thanks a lot.
But the security camera was old. The man's face was a blur. Neither the DPS nor the FBI could enhance the image electronically. The investigators were convinced they had their suspect on this tape, but his image, like their chances of finding him, were dim.
How you doing today?
As the investigation into the murder of Dean Phillips continued, witnesses reported seeing a strange blue van in town the night of the murder. Some thought they saw two people in it. Sheriff Alton Davis believed that Phillips's killer was a stranger just passing through town.
Ozona is right on Interstate 10, or more or less out in the middle of nowhere. This is the first one we've had where someone has came off the interstate and murdered one of our local people.
Investigators knew the killer was probably hundreds of miles away by now. And then they got the call. A van, matching the one described by the witnesses, was stopped about 200 miles west of town. Davis sped to the scene.
We found an old GMC van light blue, that had a dark passenger door on it, dark primer colored. And we took photographs of the van. We talked to there was a Hispanic male driving it, which didn't fit the description of our suspect.
The case had run into another dead end. Reviewing the clues they'd gathered so far, investigators realized that all they had to go on was a blurry surveillance tape and a store clerk's fading recollection. They needed some way to turn these hazy clues into solid information. Then they recalled Karen Taylor, an experienced forensic artist with the Special Crimes Service of the Texas DPS. Taylor had worked with the Ozona police on missing persons cases. She is a pioneer in the forensic art and science of facial reconstruction, developing witnesses' vague descriptions into recognizable faces of criminal suspects.
My function is to take some bit of information from a crime that occurs, produce some sort of a visual image that can be put out in the media, and hopefully it will trigger additional information that can be used to connect the crime to the victim or connect the crime to the suspect.
Ozona police sent Taylor stills taken from the videotape. But after she had evaluated the black and white photos, she wasn't sure she'd be able to help.
So I had a look at those stills to see just what I could determine about the face. It was very blurry, the quality was pretty poor, so I could see that there wasn't much likelihood we could enhance that video electronically, and it would probably boil down to my trying to just do some sort of a sketch based on what I could see.
Taylor knew that while every feature might not be rendered perfectly, the sketch's resemblance to the suspect would be strong enough to help the investigation.
Well, after years of doing this, I've come to believe that the most important thing to capture in a face for a forensic artist to trigger recognition is getting the proportions right. Each of the component parts in a face, each of the features, the eyes, nose, mouth, is important, but it's not as important as the arrangement of those features on a face.
Taylor wasn't sure the image had enough information for her to work from. Then she noticed a feature she'd overlooked: the store clerk. She had talked with the suspect face to face. Taylor hoped the clerk might provide the missing details she needed to sharpen the picture.
Using the video stills, I prepared as much of a drawing as I could, maybe 85% done, and then faxed it to the witness, got on the phone with her, and she was able to make some changes. She said she wanted me to make the eyes look light, make the lower face look more slim, and I did that. We hung up. I spent about 15 minutes making those alterations, and then I refaxed it to her, and she checked it and said, yes, that's right. So I was able to get the benefit of her long-distance input over the phone and using the fax.
Here he was, the most likely suspect in the murder of Dean Phillips. The Crockett County Sheriff's Office prepared a crime bulletin. Karen Taylor's drawing of the suspect's face was circulated across the country and to every radio station where someone might recognize the call letters on the suspect's shirt. Taylor's drawing represented the investigation's last hope. But when all the publicity brought no response, the Dean Phillips murder case came to a dead halt. The beating death of Dean Phillips looked like it was destined to go unsolved. Sheriff Alton Davis and his team had exhausted their last leads.
Eventually, we'd ruled everybody out we were getting, and the leads stopped coming in, and we didn't have anything to work on, and it just more or less went cold, and we just had to sit until we got some other type of leads.
5 years came and went without another clue or lead. But Peggy Phillips was determined to bring her husband's murderer to justice. She contacted a television crime show and asked if they'd run her story. In August 1996, just over 5.5 years after Phillips was killed, the TV show aired the story of his murder and featured Karen Taylor's drawing. That's what got the phones ringing. From around the country, viewers called in leads. Texas Ranger Jerry Byrne fielded the calls and directed the investigation. One tip led him to Paul Wesley Taylor, a convict at Utah's minimum security prison in Draper. Ranger Byrne contacted Draper Prison and asked for Taylor's records and a photograph. When he saw it, Byrne felt that at last they had tracked down their suspect.
The photograph of Paul Wesley Taylor was nearly identical to a composite drawing that a DPS artist had conducted back in 1991. Initially, I felt like it was too good to be true.
Byrne sent Taylor's records and fingerprint card to the DPS. They matched Taylor's right ring finger with the coin box fingerprint. After years without progress, this was a giant step forward. Investigators went back to the original set of clues, looking for more connections to the suspect. They found out that Taylor's brother worked at a radio station with the call letters seen on Taylor's shirt. They were now certain Paul Wesley Taylor was involved with the murder of Dean Phillips. But they wanted to know about the van's passenger, a witness or possibly an accomplice to Phillips's murder. Taylor's arrest record showed that his girlfriend had been with him at the time of his arrest in Georgia. Georgia authorities located the woman. Her answers filled the remaining gaps in the case against Taylor. She told Ranger Byrne that they had traveled through Texas during December 1990 and that Taylor had pulled up outside of a laundrette and gone in. She saw him fighting, and he returned to the van with blood on his shirt. And she certainly didn't know that anyone had been killed.
He never said that he killed him?
She led investigators to a field where Taylor had ditched his bloody clothes, along with a stolen coin box. They now had a credible witness who placed Taylor in the laundrette at the time of the murder. Utah extradited Paul Wesley Taylor back to Texas. On September 15, 1998, nearly 8 years after the killing, he pled guilty to the capital murder of Dean Phillips. On the 21st, he was sentenced to life in prison. Forensic artist Karen Taylor had turned a single blurry photograph into an image that helped unmask and apprehend a bald-faced killer.
When that photograph and drawing were presented, they knew that it was Paul Wesley Taylor. That photograph and that composite drawing is what broke this case open.
Investigators speculate that Paul Wesley Taylor got off the interstate in Ozona to get some food and gas. Short of money, Taylor got the idea to knock over the laundrette after closing time. Dean Phillips was in the wrong place at the wrong time. In other cases, tragedy stalks its victims. August 16, 1989, Joe Gilbreth finished work and arrived at his home in Villanau, Georgia. He was looking forward to spending the evening with his baby girl, Amber, and his wife, Nikia. He noticed that his wife's car was gone. This was odd. Nikia was usually home fixing supper at this hour. When he went inside, he started to worry. Nikia would never let Amber sit in her pajamas all day, and there was no way she'd ever leave the baby in the house by herself. The doors were unlocked and didn't look like they had been tampered with. When Nikia's family told Joe they hadn't heard from her, he called the police.
Nikia!
The Walker County Sheriff's Department sent officers to investigate.
Check the residence and you don't see her, and you're on the
Joe and his mother-in-law reported 3 missing items: a blue telephone cord that had been ripped from the wall, a bedspread that had a sheet stitched to one side, and all of Nikia's underwear. Based on what he found in the house, Detective Pat Bedford believed that Nikia Gilbreth's disappearance was more sinister than the simple missing persons case he was originally sent to investigate.
My first impressions are, she was taken out of here bound. Somebody forcibly was taking her from this residence. When you tie that into the fact that it was realized that a whole drawer full of her undergarments and lingerie was missing, it makes you think that we're dealing with a serious crime here.
Checked around, see if there's anything missing by chance.
Took a shower.
Joe Gilbreth told the police that the day had started like any other.
I checked all the house and
The alarm went off at 5:30. Joe got up and got ready for work. Nikia went back to bed. And by 6 a.m., the house was quiet. Joe and the baby were the last to have seen Nikia. A squad car was stationed at the house in case she might return, but Nikia never came home. On August 18, 1989, the day after she had disappeared, the Walker County Sheriff's Department had little to go on.
We got a tragedy here. We got a problem. At first, no good leads to follow up on. Her car had not been located. She had not been located. Didn't appear to have any leads from talking to neighbors and searching the immediate area. We had nothing at that point.
But that soon changed when Nikia's mother found her daughter's car abandoned on a logging road a half-mile north of the Gilbreth house. Investigators hoped they'd find clues to help locate her. Technicians raised fingerprints all over the car, but they belonged to members of the Gilbreth family. Officers found indications of a second car parked next to Nikia's. It was an ominous sign, but the tire impression wasn't distinct enough to photograph or print. Nikia's mother noted that the baby quilt Nikia always kept in the back seat was missing, and that was it. Nothing at the scene offered a clue of what had happened to Nikia or where she might be now. Still, her family held out hope that she'd come back to them unharmed. Though investigators believed she was a victim of foul play, they had no evidence and no suspects. Joe had passed a polygraph indicating that he wasn't involved. All they had were a few missing items and an abandoned car, but still no sign of Nikia. Two days later, a boy collecting empty cans along the highway made a crucial, gruesome discovery. The body was too decomposed for a positive visual ID, though it was a white female about Nikia's size with the clothes and jewelry Joe had described. Dental records confirmed everyone's worst fears. The autopsy determined that Nikia had died from asphyxiation. The examination also revealed marks around her wrists and ankles, marks that could have been made with telephone cord. But there was no other significant forensic evidence. No hairs or fibers, no fingerprints on the body. Nothing that might dictate the investigation's next step. Investigators considered a number of suspects, but none of them panned out. Leads dried up. The case went cold.
Unfortunately, we were going nowhere in the case. We had no good leads, no good suspects. Any tips that we got, we did everything from roadblocks, car to car, house to house, door to door searches, searched the area thoroughly. We weren't able to really locate anything that was helping us. Several months went by and we really weren't making any progress in solving this case. You cannot let something like this go on. You've got to be able to solve this case.
Then, 4 months after Nakia Gilbreth disappeared, investigators heard about a similar case in nearby Gordon County. A young woman was abducted by an intruder while her child slept. For 14 hours, he forced her to model lingerie for him and assaulted her repeatedly. Then, he brought her back home. Before police could identify the woman's assailant, the case took a bizarre turn. The investigation into the death of Nakia Gilbreth had led to a similar account of a woman's abduction. The connection was weak, but it was their only lead. 2 days after the assault, the woman's father reported to police that he saw a strange man drop off a Christmas tree at her house. When investigators ran the truck's license plate, they discovered that it was registered to James Ray Ward. He worked for a nearby well drilling company. The woman picked out Ward's picture from a photo lineup. She recalled that during the day she was being held, she told her assailant that she hadn't had a chance to get her child a Christmas tree. Officers took Ward into custody a short time later. Ward pled guilty to rape and was just starting a 20-year prison term. In their check into his whereabouts prior to his arrest, police learned that Ward had drilled a well at the Gilbreths a year earlier. Then he returned to check on it in July 1989, just a month before Nakia was killed. Ward's employer said that drillers were never sent back to check on wells. Ward had acted on his own. The similarities between the abduction of his rape victim and the abduction of Nakia Gilbreth provided police with their only lead. When officers searched the home Ward shared with his wife and children, they found a stash of women's undergarments that didn't belong to Ward's wife. Detectives also uncovered a receipt for well drilling made out to the Gilbreths. But it was much more than a receipt.
Had directions, the road name, the mileage that would have led me right to the Gilbreth residence. The description of the victim he had written in there matched her description, including an age of a daughter that the victim had. Then we had our first direct link from the murder to a suspect.
Investigators also found items missing from the Gilbreths' home. A bathing suit bottom, a baby quilt, a bedspread, and a blue telephone cord.
Got it. Phone cord.
In order to build the strongest case against Ward, investigators needed to prove premeditation. They obtained a statement Ward had written regarding the abduction he'd pled guilty to. They wanted to compare this writing sample with the incriminating notes jotted on the Gilbreth's receipt found in his home. Document examiner Karen Scott performed the analysis.
A handwriting comparison is basically a side-by-side comparison. I look for features in the writing of one set and I see if I find the same thing in the other set. And I'm looking for things like how the letters are on the piece of paper, how they're formed, how they're spaced.
Scott looks for the idiosyncrasies, the little details that give a person's handwriting its individual character.
For instance, the F in the word fine, it's very short, the very bottom of it. The D and the word road and side are written opposite the way people are taught. Staff first and then the round part. While this is not in and of itself a unique just to this writer, it is not the way it was taught to be done.
After comparing the note with Ward's known handwriting, Scott was confident that both documents were written by the same person. Investigators then examined the bedspread, quilt, and bathing suit bottom found in Ward's house. Nikia's mother supplied the matching top, which she found in the Gilbreth's home. Because hundreds of identical bathing suits were manufactured and sold, the prosecution had to prove that the bottom found at Ward's and the top found at the Gilbreth's were parts of the same suit. To make that assessment, the lab had to compare the amount of fiber wear on both parts of the suit. They concluded that the bottom matched the top. The suit belonged to Nikia Gilbreth. The investigation turned to the other two items, the bedspread and the baby quilt. Before she even put them under a microscope, trace evidence technician Terry Santamaria recognized their significance.
I knew that these types of bedspreads did not come commercially from the manufacturer with a sheet sewn to it, so I knew that the item had been altered by somebody. After determining that, I then examined the baby quilt. When I pulled the baby quilt out, I immediately recognized that this was homemade.
Santamaria called Detective Bedford. These two items, the bedspread and the blanket, were absolutely unique, one-of-a-kind items. They were a direct link from the suspect's home back to the victim. This evidence completed the case against James Ray Ward. At Ward's trial, Nikia's mother-in-law testified that she had stitched the sheet onto the bedspread to cover the rough cloth and had sewn the baby quilt for her granddaughter. The only way that they could have come into Ward's possession was if he had gone into the Gilbreth home and Nikia's car and taken them. Ward never confessed, but based on the evidence, investigators pieced together a scenario for the murder. On the morning of August 17th, Ward watched Joe Gilbreth leave for work. When he saw it was safe, he entered the Gilbreth home and abducted Nikia.
I believe he pulled the telephone wires and the cord away from the wall. I believe he bound her, wrapped her in the quilt, and on the way out the door also took a drawer full of her underwear and lingerie as a trophy.
Prosecutors called Ward a meticulous, organized stalker with a perverted mind. Investigators speculated that he fantasized that the women he was assaulting liked him. That might explain why he returned to place a Christmas tree at the door of one of his victims' homes. Jurors convicted him of murder, and in July 1991, after deliberating just 3 hours, he was sentenced to death for murdering Nikia Gilbreth. When the leads disappear and an investigation stalls, that doesn't mean a case is closed. In a homicide, investigators have an arsenal of forensic techniques and all the time in the world to catch the killer.